Officer Travis Bell had been on the force for 11 years. In that time, he had developed an understanding of himself that most people would call confidence, and that most honest people would call something else entirely. He believed he could read a situation. He believed he could read a person. He believed that the combination of his uniform, his experience, and his instincts had made him into something the department handbook never quite found the right words for. A man who simply knew, who belonged and who didn't, what was ordinary and what was wrong. He had never in 11 years been formally disciplined. He took this as confirmation. On the morning of October 22nd, he spotted Reverend Caleb Morris at 7:31 a.m., made his assessment in under 5 seconds, and set in motion the worst decision of his career. He never looked Caleb up. He never called the number posted beside the door. He never read the brass tag on the key ring, the tag that said clearly and in plain capital letters the single word, pastor. What happened next would cost Travis Bell everything he thought the badge had made him. But this story does not start with Bell. It starts 22 years earlier, when a 37-year-old seminary graduate named Caleb Morris drove back into a small Georgia town that had spent most of his childhood making him feel like a visitor, and decided to stay. Reverend Caleb Morris was 59 years old on the morning of his arrest. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the particular uprightness of someone who has spent decades walking into rooms where people are in pain. He had a close-cropped gray beard. He wore his Sunday suit with the careful attention of a man who understands that clothes are a form of respect. He was not what people meant when they said the word impressive. He was something more durable than impressive. He was trustworthy, which is rarer and harder to construct. He had come back to this town when the church he inherited had 17 active members and a leaking roof. He had stayed through 3 pastoral crises, 2 economic downturns, a factory closure that gutted the working class of this town, and a pandemic that required him to reorganize his entire ministry around front porch visits and phone calls at 11 at night. The food pantry he and Deacon Ruth Daniels had built together started as a closet operation. By now, it ran twice a week and served over 90 families, 22 years. He knew which elderly members needed medicine picked up on Thursdays. He knew which children came to the after-school program, not because their parents wanted enrichment, but because they needed somewhere warm and fed until 5 o'clock. He knew which men sat in the back of the sanctuary with their arms crossed and their jaws tight. Men who had come not out of faith but out of desperation, and he had learned to preach to those men specifically, not to drag them forward, but to let the words reach them wherever they were sitting. He had left once after seminary with the reasonable intention of building something clean and new in a place that hadn't already decided who he was. He came back because his mother called him and told him the church was dying, and because when he prayed about it, the answer he received was not the one he wanted, but was the one he had always in some quiet part of himself already known. Reverend Caleb Morris came back to the town that made him feel like a visitor and spent 22 years making sure nobody else felt that way. Not in his building, not on his block, not anywhere he could reach. On the morning of October 22nd, the Sunday service at Mount Zion Baptist Church was more important than most. Caleb had been planning it for 3 weeks. He had invited congregations from 4 other churches across racial lines. He had reached out to the county commissioner's office, the school board, and the managers of the factory that had closed 14 months earlier, leaving 312 people without income. The announcement he planned to make was the product of 7 weeks of quiet coordination, a town-wide relief fund, $50,000 in committed donations, structured to provide emergency assistance to laid-off workers and their families, regardless of race, church affiliation, or whether they had ever once set foot inside Mount Zion. The sermon he had prepared was titled, "Who is My Neighbor When the Road Gets Hard?" He arrived at the church at 7:31 that morning through the side entrance carrying a box of donated groceries for the pantry. rice, canned beans, cooking oil, pasta. Practical things for practical need. As he crossed the parking lot, he recorded a voice memo into his phone the way he did every Sunday morning. It was a preparation habit, a way of hearing the sermon out loud before he had to carry it in front of anyone. This particular morning, he said, "Community is tested not by how it treats the honored guest, but by how it treats the person mistaken for trouble." He pressed stop. He tucked the phone into his jacket pocket. What he did not know was that the recording application was still running. 3 years earlier, a congregant of his named Derek had been lied about in a police report. Caleb had watched him sit across the kitchen table and describe in precise and anguished detail exactly what an officer had said during a stop. The official report contained none of those words. Caleb had gone home that same night and installed an audio application on his phone keyed to elevated ambient noise. It time-stamped everything. It uploaded automatically every 3 minutes to a secure cloud server. He had never needed to think about it since. It had been running since he parked the car. It was still running when Officer Travis Bell appeared around the corner of the building. Travis Bell was 44 years old and carried 11 years on the force the way some men carry weight they no longer notice. Not as a burden. As the ordinary gravity of a life organized around authority. He was broad through the chest with the permanent sunburn of a man who spent most of his shift with one arm out the patrol window scanning. The uniform gave him a shape that his features alone did not quite produce. He had the look of a man who had never seriously considered that he might be wrong. Not because he was arrogant in any obvious way, but because the world had consistently failed to show him the kind of evidence that would have required him to reconsider. He had never been formally disciplined. He understood this the way a man understands property. It belonged to him. It was proof of something. The black community in this town had a name for his style of policing, and they said it to each other and never to him. They called it the Sunday tax. The extra minute of document review that no one else received. The extra question inserted after the legitimate ones had been answered. The additional weight of his attention settling on black men performing ordinary tasks in spaces he did not expect to find them occupying. Bell had received 6 formal complaints in 11 years. All 6 had been dismissed for insufficient corroborating evidence. He knew about the complaints the way people know about things that have not changed anything for them. They were filed. They went somewhere. Nothing happened. He was not cruel in the theatrical sense. He was meticulous. He believed the meticulous version was professional. On the morning of October 22nd, Bell received a burglary call at 7:18 a.m. An office alarm had triggered the previous night at 11:47. A resident had reported seeing a black man in a dark jacket walking near downtown. That was the full description. A black man, a dark jacket. The location was 8 blocks from Mount Zion Baptist Church. The alarm had triggered 8 hours earlier. Bell did not check the timeline. He drove toward downtown, and when he came around the side of the church on Calvary Street and saw a black man in a dark suit jacket unlocking a side door, he made his assessment. 5 seconds. He positioned himself between Caleb Morris and the entrance and waited for Caleb to turn around. The phone in Caleb's jacket pocket was uploading to the cloud server. Caleb heard the footsteps before he saw the officer. He had learned decades ago to pay attention to the particular quality of footsteps that approached from behind in places he had every right to be. He turned around slowly, keeping his hands visible, the grocery box still balanced under his left arm. Bell was standing 6 feet away with one hand resting on his belt near his weapon, not reaching for it, just resting there, the way a man rests his hand on a table to make clear he is the one sitting at the head of it. Caleb stated his name, his title, his role. He said he was the pastor of this church, that he had led this congregation for 22 years, that he was entering through the side door to deliver groceries to the food pantry before the 9 a.m. service. He said all of this in a single, measured breath, the way you say things you have said before and are saying again only because the situation requires it. Belle asked why he was entering through the side door. Caleb explained the pantry delivery. He pointed to the box. He said the side entrance was closer to the storage room. He said the groceries were for laid-off families. He said there was a service in an hour, and he needed to get the pantry stocked before the congregation arrived. Belle looked at the box. He looked at Caleb's face. He asked for identification. Caleb reached slowly into his jacket and produced his driver's license. He also held up his key ring, a brass ring with 6 keys, and a small brass tag engraved with the word pastor in capital letters. He said the church's contact deacon was Ruth Daniels, whose phone number was posted on the board beside the side entrance door, right there in plain sight, and that she would answer immediately and confirm everything he had just said. Belle took the driver's license. He held it longer than necessary. He looked at the key ring. He said keys could be stolen. Caleb asked him to call Deacon Ruth. Belle said suspects did not get to choose their witnesses. That was the moment. The word suspect. Caleb absorbed it the way he had learned to absorb the Sunday tax. Fully, precisely, without letting it pull him off course. He knew what it meant that Belle had already decided. He knew what it meant that the deacon's number posted publicly beside the door in a plastic frame had been declined as a verification source. He knew what 11 years of nothing happening to this man had produced. A confidence so settled it could not be reached by a brass key tag or a driver's license or 22 years of Sunday mornings in this specific building. He did not raise his voice. He asked Belle again clearly and quietly to please call the number on the board. Early parishioners were arriving, and then Mrs. Lillian Price came around the corner of the building. She was 80 years old, church mother, a woman who had been present at every significant moment in this congregation for 6 decades. She moved toward them immediately with the particular speed of an elderly woman who has seen this before and is not going to stand far away from it. She told Belle that she had known Caleb Morris for 22 years. She said he had baptized her grandchildren, presided at her husband's funeral, and sat with her in the hospital the night she had her first heart procedure. She said she would personally vouch for who he was and where he belonged. Belle told her to step back before she was charged with interference. Caleb looked at Mrs. Lillian Price. He said gently, and with the full weight of his pastoral instinct still operating, that she should not risk herself. He said it the way he said things to people in his care when the situation was serious and he needed them to trust him. She stepped back. She did not look away. Belle set the driver's license down on top of the grocery box and began to examine its contents. He pulled back the cardboard flap and reached inside. He pulled out a bag of rice and set it on the ground. He pulled out 2 cans of beans, a bottle of cooking oil, a bag of pasta. He set each one on the church steps with the efficient care of a man performing a procedure. The bags of rice slipped. One split at the corner. A scatter of uncooked rice spread across the concrete church steps. Caleb watched it happen and did not move. He said, "Those are for laid-off families." Belle said food pantries were commonly used to conceal stolen items. The parishioners arriving for the service watched this from the sidewalk. 7, then 12, then a group of teenagers from the choir. They watched a man in a Sunday suit stand with his hands visible while an officer searched a box of donated groceries on the steps of his own church. They watched the rice scatter. They watched Mrs. Lillian Price stand at the perimeter with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes absolutely fixed on what was happening. Caleb's sermon notes were tucked under his right arm, pressed against his side. In the movement of the grocery examination, they slipped. He reached instinctively to catch them. Belle grabbed his arm. Caleb said, "Officer, I am not resisting." Belle said, "I will decide what resistance looks like." 3 of the parishioners who heard those words would later be able to repeat them precisely word for word in the order they were spoken, because the phrase landed in them the way phrases land when you recognize in real time that they contain the full shape of a danger you have always known existed but have never heard stated so plainly. Belle handcuffed Caleb Morris's wrists behind his back and walked him to the cruiser parked on Calvary Street. The door closed with the sound that car doors make when they are designed to stay shut from the inside. Children who had arrived for choir rehearsal stood on the sidewalk and watched through the window. A little girl named Amara, 7 years old, wearing a white dress with a blue ribbon at the collar, stood beside her mother and watched the man who had given her her first Bible through the glass. She asked her mother in the voice children use when they genuinely do not understand something and expect an adult to have the answer. "Why is Pastor Caleb going to jail?" Her mother had no answer that was both honest and kind. She put her hand on Amara's shoulder and did not speak. Inside the cruiser, Caleb sat very still. His wrists were cuffed behind him. His sermon notes were somewhere on the church steps. The rice was scattered across the concrete. He thought about the relief fund. He thought about the families who had been waiting for it. He thought about the ending he had written before the middle. The line about community being tested by how it treats the person mistaken for trouble. He thought about the children who had seen this. He thought about Amara's face through the windshield as the cruiser pulled away. A child's face operating on a level of moral clarity that adults often lose. Not asking why this was possible, just asking why it was happening. He thought about the phone in his jacket pocket. It was still uploading. Deacon Ruth Daniels arrived at Mount Zion at 8:45 minutes before the service, expecting to find Caleb at his desk reviewing his notes. She found the grocery bags torn open on the church steps. She found the rice scattered across the concrete. She found the sermon notes, 2 pages of Caleb's handwriting slightly crumpled from the fall, lying beside the steps near the door. She stood on the church steps for exactly 1 moment. Not a long moment. The kind of moment in which a person understands something completely right down to its implications and has to decide in the same instant how to respond. Then her phone buzzed. A teenager from the choir was sending a video without any text attached. Ruth watched it. She watched Belle grip Caleb's arm. She heard the words. She heard the cruiser door close. She picked up the scattered sermon notes carefully, the way you pick up something that belongs to someone who is not there to pick it up themselves. She folded them, put them in her coat pocket. Then she walked into the sanctuary. The congregation was filling the pews in the anticipatory quiet of a Sunday morning before service begins. Ruth walked to the pulpit. She did not take the pulpit often. When she did, people listened. She told them without preamble and without softening it beyond what the truth required. Reverend Morris has been arrested. He is in a holding cell at the Calvary Street station 3 blocks from where we are sitting. He was arrested on the steps of this building while unlocking the side door. He had presented his identification, his church keys, and offered the officer a direct verification contact. The officer declined all 3. The sanctuary absorbed this in stages the way a body absorbs a physical shock. First, the stillness of disbelief. Then the particular silence that is not silence but the sound of a room full of people trying to hold something together at the same time. Then Ruth said, "We are not going to hold a normal service this morning. We are going to pray. And then we are going to walk 3 blocks together, peacefully, visibly, and as one body to stand outside that station and make sure the people inside understand that Reverend Morris did not arrive at that church alone this morning. He brought all of us with him. We are simply running a few minutes late." At the Calvary Street station, Belle booked Caleb for obstruction and suspected burglary investigation. The process moved at the pace of a process managed by someone who does not feel the urgency of the situation. Belle completed his written report and filed it before speaking to his shift supervisor. In that report, he described Caleb as evasive and uncooperative. He noted the dark jacket. He did not note the key ring with the brass tag. He did not note the offered deacon contact. He did not note the box of groceries or what was inside it. He did not note that the reported burglary had occurred 8 blocks away 8 hours earlier. Caleb sat in the holding room in his Sunday suit. A correctional officer named Marcus, a young black man in his late 20s, brought him a cup of water and set it on the table. Then he looked up. He said quietly that he recognized Caleb from Mercy Regional Hospital. He said Caleb had visited his mother 3 times during her illness 2 years earlier, when Marcus was working doubles and couldn't always be there. He said he was sorry. Caleb thanked him and meant it, which is how Caleb thanked people. Not as a formality, but as a full acknowledgement of what had been offered. He picked up the water, and he waited. The congregation walked out of Mount Zion at 8:52 in the morning, in 2 columns, the way they walked in procession at Easter. Not marching, walking. There is a difference, and the people of this town knew it. The news had left the church building before they did. It moved the way information moves in small communities where everyone is 2 or 3 connections from everyone else, not through announcement, but through the phone call, made from the parking lot the text sent before the car was started. The conversation between the person arriving at the diner and the owner behind the counter. The diner owner's name was Earl Potts. He had eaten at Mount Zion's Thanksgiving table during a year when the diner's pipes froze and he couldn't afford the repairs, and Caleb had organized a collection without being asked, without announcing it, and had handed him an envelope at the end of a Sunday service with a card that said simply, "The community is glad you are here." Earl had framed the card. He closed the diner at 8:51 and walked toward Calvary Street. The teachers came because Caleb had run the after-school program for 11 years. 3 of the teachers currently working in this town's elementary school had at some point in the last decade sat in the church fellowship hall watching him listen to a teenager talk through a problem that the school system had not given the child words for yet. They came because you show up for people who have showed up for you. The firefighters came because Caleb had opened the fellowship hall during 2 separate storm events and converted it into an emergency shelter. One of them, a large and generally quiet man named Dom, had a brother whose funeral Caleb had presided over, and Dom had never forgotten the specific grace with which Caleb had held that service together. The Methodist congregation arrived at 9:15, led by Pastor James Whitfield, who had left his own church in the hands of his deacons and walked across town. Because ecumenical solidarity is easy to claim and harder to practice, and Whitfield had always preferred practice to claim. The evangelical congregation from 2 miles out sent 31 members. Their pastor, a white man named Gary Sutton, had met Caleb 6 years earlier over a shared food bank coordination and had never entirely gotten over the experience of finding in Caleb Morris a man whose faith produced results Gary was still working toward in his own congregation. Each group of arrivals added a specific texture to the gathering. It was not a crowd in the sense of an undifferentiated mass. It was a ledger being assembled in public person, by person debt, by acknowledged debt act of ordinary service, meeting its witness on a sidewalk in October. By 9:30, there were 240 people outside the Calvary Street station. By 10 o'clock, there were more than 300. The sound they made was not shouting. It was the sound of a community being counted 1 person at a time. Inside the station, Bell told another officer that the church people would make noise and then go home. He had seen this before. He was right about the noise in the sense that no one was shouting. He was wrong about the going home in every other sense. Police Chief Raymond Okafor arrived at the station at 9:48. He was 56 years old, a 28-year veteran, a man known in the department for the particular quality of his patience. Not the patience of someone waiting for things to get better, but the patience of someone who understands that the decision you make in the next 3 minutes will still be producing consequences 3 years from now. He had been chief for 4 years. He had inherited several problems and had been working through them with the methodical care of someone who does not believe in shortcuts. He stepped out of his vehicle. He looked at 300 people standing in deliberate silence outside his station on a Sunday morning. He went inside. He asked his sergeant, who was in the holding room. He went to find out for himself. Chief Okafor opened the door of the holding room and looked at Reverend Caleb Morris. Caleb was sitting at the metal table in his Sunday suit. The suit was still clean, which somehow made it worse. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. His face was composed in the particular way of a man who has decided how he will conduct himself in this specific situation and is executing that decision with full attention. He looked like what he was, a 59-year-old pastor waiting with the patience of someone who has spent a career sitting with people in difficult rooms and knows that patience in those rooms is not a passive quality, but an active one. Okafor said, "What is your name and what is your role?" Caleb told him. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he excused himself and found Bell. He asked Bell one question, "Did you verify?" Bell repeated the suspect description. He said the individual matched the profile. He said the credentials presented were insufficient for on-site verification. Okafor asked whether Bell had checked the posted contact number beside the side entrance door. Bell said suspects did not get to choose their verification contacts. Okafor asked whether Bell had compared the burglary report's location and timestamp against the time and place of the current incident. Bell said the suspect description was sufficient probable cause. Okafor looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked Bell to get him a copy of the arrest report. He read it standing at the duty desk, and the more he read, the quieter he became. Bell had described Caleb as evasive. He had noted the dark jacket. He had not noted the keyring with the brass pastor tag. He had not noted the driver's license he had physically held. He had not noted the deacon's name or the posted number. He had described the grocery box as a possible concealment vehicle. He had not noted its contents. He had not noted that the reported burglary was 8 blocks away and 8 hours earlier. He set the report down on the duty desk. He did not pick it up again. Outside, Deacon Ruth Daniels had done something no one had asked her to do that turned out to be exactly right. She had opened Caleb's voice memo from that morning, the one she had received through their shared pastoral notes application, and connected her phone to a portable Bluetooth speaker she had borrowed from the church's audio cabinet. She played it for the crowd. Caleb's voice came through at ordinary conversational volume on a quiet Sunday street. He spoke about the sermon he was preparing. He talked about the families he hoped would be there, and then he said the line, "Community is tested not by how it treats the honored guest, but by how it treats the person mistaken for trouble." 300 people standing outside a police station heard a man describe what had happened to him before it happened to him in his own voice, in his own words, recorded by his own hand in the parking lot 40 minutes earlier. Several people cried, not loudly. The kind of crying that happens when something lands with the full force of what it means. Inside the holding room, Caleb sat with his hands folded on the table and said nothing about the phone in his jacket pocket. He was waiting. He was very good at waiting. Captain Dale Marsh, the local police union representative, arrived at the Calvary Street station at 10:12. He was 60 years old, former patrol officer, 12 years as the union rep, a man with the specific institutional reflexes of someone whose job was to protect officers first and evaluate circumstances second. He was not malicious. He was practiced, which is a different kind of problem. He met briefly with Okafor, then, without waiting for the outcome of the review, went to the station's front entrance and gave a statement to the 2 reporters who had arrived. He said Officer Bell had responded to an active burglary call and encountered an individual who could not provide verifiable on-site identification. He said Bell had followed lawful detention procedure. He said the department would support its officers in the performance of their duties. The statement appeared online at 10:34 a.m. 3 local outlets ran it within the hour. The framing settled around it like concrete around a post. Pastor arrested in credential dispute. Officer followed protocol. Community gathers. None of the stories mentioned the key ring. None mentioned the grocery box or the rice on the church steps. None mentioned that an 80-year-old parishioner had tried to vouch for Caleb by name and been threatened with an interference charge. The institutional wall was visible, and it was holding. Okafor, during a break from managing the front of the station, asked his internal affairs sergeant to pull Bell's complete complaint history. The file arrived in 11 minutes. It was thicker than Okafor expected. 6 formal complaints. 11 years. All dismissed for insufficient corroborating evidence. But it was not the dismissals that held his attention. It was the pattern underneath them. 4 of the 6 complaints involved black men stopped while performing acts of ordinary service near community buildings. A custodian at the community theater carrying cleaning supplies to the loading dock. A deacon from a church on the east side loading folding chairs into a van. A youth mentor arriving early to a community center carrying a bag of sports equipment. And 3 years earlier, a woman named Gloria Tate stopped while carrying food pantry supplies to a church building 2 towns over, who had filed a complaint that was dismissed because Bell's report noted she had been unable to provide verifiable on-site proof of her volunteer role. The same structure. The same result. Every time. Okafor pulled up the original burglary report. The alarm had triggered at 11:47 the previous night. The incident was classified as a possible attempted entry at a commercial property on Merchant Street, 0.8 of a mile from Mount Zion Baptist Church on Calvary Street. The overnight officers had cleared the scene and found no evidence of forced entry. Caleb Morris had arrived at the church's side entrance at 7:31 in the morning, 7 hours and 39 minutes after the incident, 0.8 of a mile from the incident, at a church he had led for 22 years. Bell had never compared these numbers. He had seen what he expected to see, and responded to what he expected. Gloria Tate. The woman from the complaint 3 years earlier was standing in the crowd outside the station. She had received a call from a member of her own congregation at 9:05 that morning and had driven 40 minutes to get here. She did not know Caleb personally. She had come because the story she heard on the phone was the same story she had lived in a church parking lot 3 years ago, and because the complaint she had filed had gone nowhere, and because standing in a crowd this specific and this quiet felt like the first version of being heard she had been offered since. Inside the holding room, Caleb sat in his Sunday suit and performed with the full discipline of 22 years of ministry the act of remaining himself. He was 59 years old, and he had been cuffed on the steps of his own church in front of his own congregation on the morning of the most important service he had planned in years. His sermon notes were on the sidewalk. The groceries were scattered across the church steps. Mrs. Lillian Price had been told she risked an interference charge for telling the truth about a man she had known for 2 decades. And he was sitting in a metal room because a man with a badge had looked at him for 5 seconds and decided he was trouble. He thought about the laid-off families who had been waiting 6 weeks for the announcement. A correctional officer named Marcus came back with a second cup of water and said quietly that his mother's name was Adele. He said Caleb had shown up on 3 Tuesday afternoons when she was in the oncology ward, and Marcus was working double shifts and couldn't be there, and had sat with her and talked about the garden she kept at home, which she could not stop thinking about. He said his mother had told him about those visits more than she had told him about almost anything else from that period. Caleb said, "How is she doing?" Marcus said she was cancer-free for 18 months. Caleb said he was glad. Marcus went back to his post, and Caleb sat with that exchange for a moment the way you sit with things that arrive unexpectedly in hard places and remind you of the shape of what you have been building. Outside the station, Amara, the little girl in the white dress with the blue ribbon, was sitting on the curb beside her mother. She had not cried. She was 7 years old, and she had the particular seriousness of a child who has decided that what is happening requires her full attention. She had asked her question an hour ago and had not received an answer, and she was still waiting for one with the patience of someone who has not yet learned to substitute distraction for resolution. Her mother, Denise, sat beside her with her hand on Amara's back. Denise was a single mother, a preschool teacher's aide, a woman who had brought Amara to Mount Zion because she believed the church would give her daughter a framework for making sense of the world. She was sitting on a curb outside a police station trying to construct in real time an answer to a 7-year-old's question that was both honest and survivable. She had not found one. She kept her hand on Amara's back and watched the doors. Diana Reeves arrived at the station at 10:28. She was a civil rights attorney, 19 years of practice in Georgia. A woman who had built her entire career around the specific and difficult work of holding institutions to the promises they had made in their own written policies. She was not loud or dramatic. She was thorough, which is a more durable quality. She went to the holding room. She sat across from Caleb. She asked him what happened. Caleb told her precisely in order without editorializing. When he finished, she asked him one question. "Was the phone in your jacket pocket recording?" He said yes. She said, "And it uploaded automatically?" He said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her briefcase and said they were ready. Diana Reeves had been practicing civil rights law for 19 years, and in that time she had developed the ability to become very still when something significant happened. Not cold, not detached. Still the way water goes still before it moves fast. She accessed the cloud server on her laptop, pulled up the recording, and listened to the first 4 minutes without speaking. She listened to Belle's approach. She listened to Caleb's clear, patient attempts at verification. She listened to the keyring being dismissed. She listened to the deacon's contact information being refused on the grounds that suspects did not choose their witnesses. She listened to the grocery bags being torn open. She listened to Mrs. Lillian Price being told to step back before she faced a charge. She listened to the 6 consecutive minutes during which Caleb continued to offer verification and Belle continued to decline it. She heard the phrase, "I will decide what resistance looks like," and she heard the cruiser door. She requested a meeting with Chief Okafor and Captain Marsh. They assembled in Okafor's office. Diana placed her laptop on the desk's edge and told them the meeting would be brief. She said Caleb's phone had been recording from the moment Belle approached him that morning. She said the recording was complete time-stamped and uploaded to a secure server. She said it had already been shared with her firm's secure archive, which meant it existed in at least 3 independent locations. She said she intended to play 30 seconds of it, and then she wanted to discuss what the department intended to do next. She pressed play. Marsh heard his own officer's voice telling a pastor that suspects do not get to choose their witnesses. He heard the keyring being dismissed. He heard the instruction to an 80-year-old parishioner that she risked an interference charge. He heard the phrase. He said nothing. He looked at the desk. Okafor asked her to play it again. She did. The 30 seconds played a second time in the quiet office, while 300 people stood in silence outside the building's front doors. Marsh had issued a public statement defending Belle's conduct that morning. That statement was now attached in the public record of every outlet that had run it to a version of events that the recording directly and completely contradicted. Every specific claim, every defense, every point of the institutional frame he had built that morning contradicted by the audio. The key ring was on the recording. The deacon contact was on the recording. The grocery box was on the recording. The systematic refusal of every offered verification method was on the recording. He did not immediately respond. He was performing the calculation of a man who has just discovered the floor beneath the floor. Diana looked at Okafor and said, "The 300 people outside this building are going to hear your decision one way or another." She said she would prefer to tell them something that reflected well on this institution. She said she would leave the content of that decision entirely to him. She closed the laptop. The room was very quiet. Okafor asked Belle to come to his office. Belle came in with the posture of a man who expects to be defended. Okafor told him to sit down. Belle sat. Okafor played the recording. Belle heard his own voice. The specific quality of hearing your own voice say things you believed were defensible and hearing them be indefensible is unlike any other form of self-recognition. It is not the voice that sounds different. It is the space between what you believed you were doing and what you actually did made audible and permanent. He heard himself refuse the key ring. He heard himself threaten Mrs. Lillian Price. He heard the phrase about resistance. he heard the cruiser door. He was very still. Okafor said your written report states that Reverend Morris was evasive and uncooperative. He said I have listened to 11 minutes of audio in which Reverend Morris offered 3 independent methods of verification, remained calm under conditions that would have justified a different response, and was arrested anyway. He said I need you to help me understand how those 2 accounts describe the same event. Bell did not have an answer. Okafor released Caleb without charges. He said it plainly, all of it completely dropped without softening it in institutional language. He said he was sorry for what had occurred. He said the word sorry precisely without qualification. Caleb thanked him. He asked if he could have a few minutes before going outside. He sat alone in the holding room for 4 minutes. He was not crying. He was not formulating remarks. He was sitting with what the morning had been taking its full weight before setting it down, which is a thing he had learned to do in hospital rooms and at kitchen tables in the middle of the night when people were telling him the worst thing that had happened to them. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out. Ruth Daniels was standing near the portable speaker when the station's front door opened and Caleb Morris walked out. She saw him before anyone else did because she had been watching those doors for 2.5 hours with the specific attention of a woman who has organized her life around not looking away from things that matter. He was wearing the same Sunday suit. His jacket was straight. His beard was the same. He walked with the same measured uprightness, and he had not been diminished by the morning, which was its own form of answer to everything Bell had assumed about what it meant to put this man in a cruiser. But his wrists, where the cuffs had been, were marked, not injured. Marked. The crowd saw the marks. The singing that began was not a triumphant sound. It was the doxology, the same hymn the congregation would have sung as the opening of the service at 9 a.m., if the morning had gone as planned. The fact that they were now on a sidewalk outside a police station, that the man they were singing for had reddened wrists and no sermon notes, none of that changed the hymn. The hymn was the same as it would have been, which made it feel like exactly the right thing. Caleb raised one hand. The singing tapered to quiet. He stood on the station steps and looked at the gathering. He looked at the Methodist pastor in the back. He looked at the factory workers who had come. He looked at Gloria Tate, whom he did not know, who had driven 40 minutes for reasons that were entirely her own. He looked at Amara standing beside her mother with the ribbon still in her hair and whose question had still not received an answer. He said, "I want to tell you what happened this morning." He said a police officer had approached him at the side entrance of this church and had decided in 5 seconds that he was more likely to be a criminal than a pastor. He said he had offered his identification, his church keys with the brass tag that said pastor and the direct contact information of his deacon. He said all 3 had been refused. He said the grocery box he was carrying for laid-off families had been searched on the church steps and the bags had been torn open. He said an 80-year-old member of this congregation had been threatened with an interference charge for telling the truth. He said he had been cuffed and placed in a cruiser on his own street on a Sunday morning while children watched through the window. He said the only difference between me and every other person this officer has stopped the same way is that my phone was listening. He did not raise his voice. He did not invite applause. He was simply telling the true account of the morning, in order in the language of someone who is not performing, but informing, which is a harder and more dignified thing to do. Then he said, "I do not want you to turn this pain into hatred. There is enough hatred in the world that already looks exactly like what happened to me today. I do not want us to produce more of it. But I also need to say clearly so nobody in this crowd is confused. Silence is not the same as peace. Silence is what allowed this to happen 11 times before it happened to me. And I will not be quiet about that." Diana Reeves filed the formal civil rights complaint with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division from the parking lot of the Calvary Street Station at 11:22 a.m. She filed it before Bell had been formally notified of his administrative leave because she understood that documentation done early could not be undone later. Bell was notified of his leave at 11:45 a.m. by Okafor personally. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation received Diana's formal notification and request for parallel review at 12:03 p.m. None of this was visible to the crowd outside. They were watching the doors. Diana Reeves held a press conference at 9 a.m. on Monday morning in the parking lot of Mount Zion Baptist Church. She had chosen the location deliberately. The church steps were still there. The concrete was still there. The side door was there with the deacon's contact number posted in its plastic frame beside it exactly where it had been when Bell refused to call it. She set up a portable speaker and played the full recording. 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The reporters had their phones out. 3 television cameras were there. Community members from Sunday's gathering had returned. People who had not been part of the crowd came because they had seen the coverage and wanted to understand what had actually happened. They heard Caleb's voice, measured and specific, stating his name and role. They heard Bell's voice. They heard the key ring being examined and dismissed. They heard the deacon's contact information being refused on the grounds that suspects did not choose their witnesses. They heard the grocery bags being torn open. They heard Mrs. Lillian Price being told to step back before she faced an interference charge. They heard 6 consecutive minutes during which Caleb continued to offer verification, and Bell continued to decline it. They heard the phrase. They heard the cruiser door. Diana then placed Bell's written arrest report on a table beside the speaker and read the relevant sections aloud side by side with the corresponding audio. The report said Caleb was evasive. The recording captured 6 minutes of Caleb offering verification. The report did not mention the key ring. The recording captured Bell physically handling the brass pastor tag. The report described the grocery box as a possible concealment vehicle. The recording captured Bell tearing open bags of rice and canned goods while Caleb explained that the contents were for laid-off families. 9 specific discrepancies between the written report and the recorded audio. 9. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation formally elevated the case to an active criminal investigation that morning, citing the recording as primary evidence and Bell's 6 prior complaints as supporting context. 2 potential charges filing a false official police report and deprivation of rights under color of law. The union's withdrawal of its public statement was now being read alongside the original statement by every reporter covering the story. The juxtaposition produced its own evidence of what had happened. An institution that had publicly defended conduct, it had now publicly abandoned, with the recording demonstrating precisely why the defense could not be sustained. Captain Dale Marsh gave no further public comment. His name remained attached to the original statement in every archived article. That permanence was not something he could withdraw. The GBI investigation concluded in 3 months and 2 weeks. Bell was indicted on 2 counts filing a false official report and civil rights deprivation under Georgia law. The first indictment of its kind in this county in 11 years. Bell's trial lasted 4 days. The recording was the centerpiece of the prosecution. Marcus, the correctional officer, testified that Bell's arrest report had been filed before Bell had spoken to his shift supervisor, meaning the characterization of Caleb as evasive had been produced before any supervisory review of the incident had occurred. The report had not been the product of a completed process. It had been the product of Bell deciding what the story was going to be before anyone asked him to account for it. Mrs. Lillian Price testified. She was 80 years old, and she sat in the witness chair in her good dress and spoke in the steady, unhurried voice of a woman who has had 80 years to develop clarity about what she will and will not be silent about. She said she had attempted to identify Reverend Morris and had been told she risked an interference charge for doing so. She said she had lived in this town for 61 years. She said she had never in 61 years been told she risked a charge for telling the truth. Gloria Tate testified. She described her own encounter with Bell 3 years earlier. The pantry supplies, the church parking lot, the complaint that had been dismissed. She said the word Belle had used in her written report was evasive. She said she had never considered herself an evasive person. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Guilty on both counts. Bell lost his badge. He lost his pension, which would have vested at 12 years of service and which was forfeited at 11 years and 3 months 105 days short of the threshold. He lost his law enforcement certification and any future eligibility for a government security position. His appeal was filed and denied within 6 months. The recording made appeal structurally impossible. There was no interpretation of the audio that supported the written report, and the written report was the foundation of everything his defense had made. 4 months after the verdict, Bell took a job at a private medical security company 2 counties over, managing visitor access at a regional hospital complex. His role required him to check visitor logs against an automated credentialing system and admit or deny entry based on what the system returned. He wore a vest with his employee identification number on it. He did not make assessments. He did not exercise judgment. He entered data, and the system decided. He had spent 11 years deciding who belonged and who did not. Now the decision was made for him every shift by software that did not know his name. Some people who heard this said it was justice. Some said it was poetic. Caleb, when he heard it, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said he is working. He is doing a job. I hope he does it honestly. That was the most and least forgiving thing anyone said about Travis Bell in the aftermath. The relief fund Caleb had planned to announce on the Sunday of his arrest was announced the following Sunday instead to a sanctuary fuller than it had been in 22 years. Not because the arrest had made the church famous, because the Sunday of the arrest had been a form of introduction. Person by person, group by group, denomination by denomination, the town had discovered who Mount Zion was, what it had been doing quietly and consistently for 2 decades, and what it meant that this was the man who had been put in handcuffs on his own church steps for carrying groceries. The gathering outside the Calvary Street station had been the first time many of them had stood in the same space at the same time for the same reason. And it turned out that once you have done that, the distance between you shrinks in ways that are hard to reverse. The fund raised 3 times its initial goal in 2 weeks. Caleb insisted that the disbursement criteria include laid-off workers of every background, regardless of church affiliation or whether they had been part of any of the gatherings. He said, "Hunger does not ask which side of the street you stood on. This is not a reward. It is what it was always going to be." The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened a broader review of the department's complaint dismissal procedures. 4 prior complaints against Bell were formally reopened. 2 resulted in civil settlements for individuals who had originally filed them and been told there was insufficient evidence. Diana Reeves filed the civil suit on Caleb's behalf and settled it without going to trial. The settlement amount was not disclosed publicly. Caleb disclosed what he did with it. He posted a single handwritten note on the church bulletin board in his own handwriting, which said that the settlement funds had been directed entirely to the food pantry's operating fund covering 3 years of projected costs. Signed simply, Reverend Caleb Morris, Pastor. No press release, no announcement from the pulpit. Just the note on the board where the people who needed to know would see it. Travis Bell's indictment was one outcome. His pension forfeiture was another. But the third consequence, which arrived quietly and without fanfare, was the one that lasted in a way Bell had not anticipated. The recording was admitted into the Georgia Law Enforcement Training Center's curriculum as a documented case study in unlawful field conduct and false report construction. It was played for every new class of recruits in the state. Bell's voice, the flat certainty of a man who was wrong about everything he was certain of, became a training instrument. The person he had tried to diminish became his legacy. Caleb Morris taught more police officers through that recording than Bell had trained officers in 11 years of patrol. The following Sunday morning, Caleb arrived at Mount Zion's side entrance with a new box of groceries. The morning was cooler than the previous week. The leaves in the parking lot were turning at the edges. He parked in his usual spot, picked up the box, tucked his sermon notes under his arm. 3 members of the congregation were already there unloading supplies from their own cars. A teenager named Darius, 16 years old, a boy from the after-school program who had been attending choir for 3 years, was carrying a case of canned soup from the back of his mother's SUV when he saw Caleb's sermon notes start to slip. He put down the soup, crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and caught the pages before they hit the ground. He held them out. He did not comment on what the steps had looked like 5 weeks ago. He already knew. He handed the notes back carefully, the way you hand someone something that belongs to them. The final image belongs to Caleb at the pulpit looking out at a full sanctuary. Not full because the church had become famous. Full because the town had finally understood what it means to show up. Not in a crisis, not in front of a camera, not as a statement, but as a practice in the same building on the same morning, for the same unglamorous and essential reasons that Caleb Morris had been showing up for 22 years. He looked out at the congregation. He looked at Amara in the 3rd row, wearing a different dress this week, sitting beside her mother with her hands folded in her lap, ready. He opened his notes. He found the first line of the sermon he had not gotten to preach last week. He looked up at the people who had come, and he began. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel. Every week we bring you stories of courage, justice, and the people who refuse to be erased. We are here because they were.